Hey guys, it's Alex. So it's been awesome to hear from you guys and especially hear which animals you would take back from the zoo. I've heard cheetah, I've heard chimpanzee, Jackson and Eloise, they said a white tiger and a stingray, which both sound like very great animals. So we are gonna get started. I've had a pretty good day. I hope you guys have too. I was gonna try and do some crazy eyeliner and then I realized that my eyeliner is 4 years old and it doesn't work. So, we didn't do that. But time to start reading. And where we left off was the middle of chapter 5. And we have heard from somebody named Proc who talked to the professor and said that he was going to try and make sure they didn't get to Whangdoodle Land. And Ben has just said that he thinks that flowers are a bit sissy for a boy. And the professor has invited them back in to go see something. So the children followed him as he climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the small white door. "I'll have you know," he said as he unlocked it, "that I allow very few people in here. Very few indeed." He stepped aside to let them through. They gasped when they saw the room. Ben felt as if he had stepped into a small paradise. "Look at that telescope," he said. "What are those lights?" Tom asked. "That's a model of a problem I've been working on." The professor moved over to it. "It's made of special fiber optic glass which allows the light to shine through in such an interesting way. It's good, isn't it?" "It sure is." Tom sounded almost reverent. The professor took the cover off a large microscope. "This is what I wanted to show you, Ben. This is called a binocular microscope because you look through it with both eyes. Give me that flower, Lindy." She handed him the chrysanthemum. The professor carefully removed a single white petal and placed it under the lens. "Look in here now," he said. "This should make flowers a little more interesting." The children took turns and each saw something that resembled an aerial photograph of a river with many streams feeding into it, a latticework of tiny interconnecting tubes. "Those veins, or tubes, carry energy to the cells in the petal," the professor explained. "See what happens if I put a drop of ink into the stem of the petal? See how the blue circulates through every little vein? That's just how blood circulates through your bodies." Lindy made a face. "I don't like blood. It's gross." "Well, that's a silly remark. Blood carries nutrition and energy and food to every part of your body. So instead of saying gross, you should be saying how wonderful." The professor turned to the boys. "I want to make a point and I want you to learn it well," he said. "I know there are times when things seem rather boring to you or not worth your interest. Like this flower today. Once you noticed its color and the fact that it was growing, you dismissed it. It was sissy. A magnificent creation like a flower is definitely not sissy. When I showed you the flower under the microscope, you learned that there was a whole new dimension to it." "What's a dimension?" Lindy asked. "In this case, it means going one step beyond what you already see or know. Finding another world, one that has been there all along, just waiting for you to discover it." "Like Whangdoodle Land," she said. "Is that a dimension?" "In a way, yes," said the professor. "My point is this. I don't want you ever again to take something at face value, to take things for granted. Let your curiosity run away with you. Know that beyond every ordinary explanation, there is a deeper and more exciting discovery to be made." There was a knock on the door and Mrs. Primrose entered. "Tea is ready, sir." "Fine," said the professor. "Then that will end our lesson for today. Tomorrow we are going to go on a picnic, so bring your bicycles. Also, you should dress in weatherproof clothes, because it is going to rain." "How on earth do you know that?" Tom asked. The professor rumpled the boy's hair. "I'm a scientist, Thomas, and I also heard the weather forecast on the radio." They all laughed and clattered downstairs to tea. That evening the children were elated. Lindy especially was keyed up. Her powers of concentration had been put to good use that afternoon. By dinner time she was so excited she was almost unable to eat. Mrs. Potter tried not to show her concern. "Lindy dear, don't just stare at your plate. Eat your stew and dumplings." It's not stew, and they're not dumplings, Lindy answered. It's a brown land with mountains, and the dumplings are sponges. White sponges that will suck you up if you go too near them. What's this? What are you talking about? Mr. Potter gave his daughter a keen glance. No, not sponges. Lindy changed her mind. They're giant boulders, and I wish I were small enough to climb one. Mrs. Potter said, I think this afternoon has been a little too much for you. You're being very silly. It's not silly, Mom. Tom came to Lindy's defense. Look at the peas on my plate. Don't they look like tiny green stones? Like when you're at the seaside and the beach is all pebbles? They just look like peas to me, replied Mrs. Potter. I think you all need an early night. As Lindy was preparing for bed, Tom knocked on the door of her room. Lindy, can I come in? What do you want, Tom? Here's that quarter I owe you. He put it on her bedside table. Lindy examined the 25-cent piece. Thanks, but you don't really need to give this to me. Do you want it back? Tom was surprised, and he thought about it for a moment. No, he said, you want it fairly, and besides, if you hadn't gone up to Stonehouse, we'd never have met the professor. She smiled at him. Tell you what, I won't ever spend it. I'll just keep it to remind me of Halloween. It'll be my lucky piece from now on. In a rare show of affection for his sister, Tom patted her on the shoulder. Okay. Well, good night. Good night, Tom. Lindy slowly removed her slippers and bathrobe. She pulled her curtains and brushed her teeth, and then climbed into her comfortable brass bed. She lay back against the pillows and thought about the afternoon and how wonderful it had been. She thought about the professor and Sneezewort and the incredible microscope. Soon she began to drift into sleep. Through half-closed eyes she gazed at the curtains pulled across her windows. They were pretty curtains, printed with flowers of the countryside, red and orange poppies, white and yellow daisies, and blue cornflowers. Lindy thought, as she often did, how nice it would be to walk in a field filled with flowers like that. The curtains moved very slightly. She stretched out a hand to touch the flowers, which almost seemed within her grasp. When Mrs. Potter came upstairs to say goodnight to her daughter, she found her already asleep, smiling peacefully, and with one hand open on the coverlet. Chapter 6. It was raining hard when the children woke the following morning. Ben was sure they would not be going on a picnic in such weather. He predicted that the professor would cancel the whole thing. The professor phoned at midday, but only to confirm with Mrs. Potter that it was all right for the children to meet him at 2:30 that afternoon. By 2 o'clock, Lindy, Ben, and Tom looked as if they could attempt an expedition to the North Pole. They wore heavy sweaters and trousers tucked into thick rubber boots. Lindy had on a cape that she often wore when she walked to school. It was a very sensible covering because she could keep her hands dry inside, and her books, too. She wore a large sou'wester that came down so low on her head that only her nose and chin were visible beneath it. Tom wore a duffel coat with the hood pulled up and a scarf, and Ben had on an old raincoat and an oilskin hat that his father used when he went fishing. Professor Savant was waiting for them on the porch when they arrived. He was wearing a most extraordinary outfit, long waterproof pants and a transparent plastic coat tied at the waist, which gave a balloon-like effect to the upper half of his body. He wore a peaked cap and sturdy, heavy brogues covered by plastic overshoes. He greeted the children with his customary enthusiasm. "Hello there," he yelled. "Isn't this just a marvelous day? I love the rain, don't you?" "How are we going to have a picnic?" asked Tom. "You'll see, you'll see." The professor disappeared behind the house and a moment later reappeared pushing the oldest bicycle the children had ever seen. The handlebars were bent, spokes were missing, the seat was tilted at a ridiculous angle, and the whole contraption made a terrible squeaking sound. "I haven't ridden one of these things for quite a while," said the professor. "Now, let me see." He attempted to swing a leg over the saddle. "Ha-ha! This is going to be tricky." He tried again, this time successfully enough, and at least to get his feet on the pedals. With fierce concentration, he began to wobble around the drive. "Just getting warmed up," he announced with a grin, at which point his trousers caught in the chain and he came to a shuddering stop. "Oh, fiddlesticks." The children giggled. "Mrs. Primrose," he yelled, "I need bicycle clips." He yanked the bike into an upright position. "Bicycle clips, sir? You don't have any." Bother, what am I going to do? Tuck your trousers in your socks, Tom suggested. Good idea, but my socks are too short, my underwear is too long, and it would get all wet in the rain. The professor illustrated this by hitching up his trousers. The children had a glimpse of white long johns on his skinny legs and a pair of startling red socks. I do have these, sir, if you wouldn't mind wearing them. Mrs. Primrose put a hand in her apron pocket and shyly produced a pair of lavender garters. The professor raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. Well, he said, I haven't seen a pair of those in a long time. They'll do splendidly, Mrs. Primrose. He folded his trousers and put the garters over them. I think they look very fetching. He hopped about in the rain to show them off. Mrs. Primrose pointed to his bicycle. I do wish you wouldn't ride that thing, sir. It's lethal, really it is. Nonsense, woman, I shall be perfectly all right. Well, come along, Potters. The afternoon will be over before we get started. He climbed on the bicycle and began to wobble his way down the drive. The children hurriedly pedaled after him, calling goodbye to an anxious-looking Mrs. Primrose. It soon became apparent that not only was the professor's bike dangerous to ride, but the professor was a definite road hazard. He had a strong tendency to aim his bike at an object, a tree, a car, a pedestrian, and only at the last second would he swerve to avoid it. He turned corners sharply without so much as a hand signal, and the children were never certain what he would do next. They discovered that it was easier and safer if they rode a few yards behind. The professor seemed to need most of the road for himself. Lindy was rather concerned. Are you going to be all right? She called. Yes, Lindy, no cause for alarm. I'll get the hang of this thing in a while. They pedaled slowly through the outskirts of the town. The children liked the feel of the raindrops on their faces. Their bicycle tires made a pleasant hissing sound on the wet road and sent up small fountains of spray. The professor led them into a delightful country area. Busy streets gave way to empty lanes where the wet trees dripped noisily onto the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The ride obviously began to have a soothing effect on the professor, for he soon became less erratic, and the children were able to pull abreast of him. The professor began to sing, She'll Be Comin' Round the Mountain. He had a terrible voice, but his enthusiasm was contagious. The children joined in. You're not singing nearly loud enough, cried the professor. I can't hear you at all. The children sang at the tops of their voices. Fortunately, there was no traffic about, because now they were all bicycling in a haphazard way and laughing so much that half the time they weren't looking where they were going. The professor suddenly swung his bike off the road and onto a small track. Where is this? Asked Tom as they bumped and jogged their way along. This is where we have our picnic, replied the professor. He turned into an open field and braked to a halt in front of a dilapidated stone building. What a funny house, said Lindy. Who owns this place? I do. The professor removed a picnic basket from his bicycle and led the way through the tall wet grass to a large door at the front of the building. Ben, put a shoulder to this with me. You too, Tom. The professor pushed hard against the heavy door and the boys added their weight to his. The door began to move and, after a second push, it swung open. The boys stumbled through a cloud of dust into a long, high room. What a great place, Ben declared. I'm glad you like it. The professor smiled proudly. This old barn is all that remains of a farmhouse. I might restore the place one day. In the meantime, it seemed like a good spot to come and have a picnic. Look, I found a horseshoe, Lindy cried excitedly. Well, that's a lucky beginning. Now, we'd better get started on a fire, otherwise it'll be too damp and cold in here. Boys, go to the back of the house. There should be plenty of dry kindling under the trees. Lindy, help me put this cloth down so that we can spread our picnic on it. It didn't take long to get things organized. Quite soon, everyone was sitting in the middle of the stone floor around a crackling wood fire. The children were starving. Mrs. Primrose had packed all manners of goodies for them, sausage rolls and peanut butter sandwiches, a sponge cake with jam, and oatmeal cookies and bananas. There were milk and ginger ale to drink. This is really terrific, said Tom, his cheeks rosy from the fire and his mouth full of cake. The professor pushed his plate away and leaned back on one elbow. Tell me your favorite word, somebody. Better still, tell me the 3 nicest words you can think of. Yellow, sunshine, mother of pearl, Lindy said quickly. Splendid. What about you, Ben? Ooh. Acetylsalicylic. Aestilsalic. Aestilsalic, the boy replied. I should have double-checked this word. What's that? Asked Tom. It's what aspirin is made of, isn't it, Professor? Aestilsalic. Aestilsalic, that's what we'll go with. Right, Ben. The chemical name for aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid. That is a good word. It rolls off the tongue nicely. Obviously not my tongue. Tom said, I've got the best word, anti-disestablishmentarianism. Oh, everybody knows that, Ben pointed out. Does everyone know what it means? Asked the professor. The children were silent. It's no use using a word unless you know about it. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. The word came out of 19th century England. We'll look it up when we get home. What's your favorite word? Lindy asked. Good heavens, there are thousands that I like. Well, choose one. The professor thought for a moment. Papilionaceous, he said, from Latin, meaning resembling a butterfly, or shaped like a butterfly. The French word for butterfly is similar. It's papillon. Papilionaceous. That's lovely, said Lindy. Your name is French, isn't it, Professor? Ben asked suddenly. Isn't savant a French name? It is indeed. My father was French, and my mother was an American. Do you have any children? Yes, Lindy, I have 2 grown-up daughters. The eldest is married to a dentist in Boston, and the youngest is with the Peace Corps. What about your wife? Ben asked. She passed away many years ago. The professor gazed into the fire. She was very pretty. She loved to travel and to give parties. You might say she was papilionaceous, a very sweet butterfly. He leaned forward and threw another log into the flames. Speaking of butterflies, wait until you see the ones they have in Whangdoodle Land. You won't believe your eyes. What's so special about them? Tom asked eagerly. Well, they're about the size of a robin and brilliantly colored. They're called flutterbys. Wow, if butterflies are as big as robins, then how big are the birds? Ben laughed. Well, one bird is quite big, replied the professor, and I can't wait for you to meet her. She's the wiffle bird. She's quite wonderful and very, very beautiful. She'll be a good friend to us in Whangdoodle Land, for she loves company, although she is shy and easily frightened. Now we had better continue our lessons, or you'll never get to see her at all. Ben, throw me one of those ginger ale bottles. This wood smoke is making me thirsty. Ben took a bottle from the picnic basket and handed it to the professor, who proceeded to shake it violently. Watch out, he said with a grin, and unscrewed the cap. A fountain of ginger ale shot into the air. The children screamed with delight. I haven't done that since I was a boy, said the professor wickedly. My word, look at all those bubbles. Hold the bottle up to the light. It's like a waterfall, only falling up instead of down. Lindy said, The bubbles are like tiny crystal beads. How do they get in there? That's the carbonation, replied the professor. What's carbonation? Adding carbon dioxide to liquid. Since gas is lighter than liquid, the bubbles rise, as you see. He held the bottle close to his ear. Listen, they make a nice hissing sound. Lindy took the bottle and listened. Her face registered surprise. Ooh, it goes up! The noise goes up! The professor said, You must practice the art of listening. It will be most important when we get to Whangdoodle Land. Do you ever lie in bed and count all the things you can hear? I do, said Tom. I can hear Mom in the kitchen in the morning, and Ethel using the vacuum cleaner, and cars and airplanes and birds. It's nice. Trouble is, I never want to get up. Listen to the noises right now, said the professor. The children were silent. They heard the rain, a bird calling out in the wood, the fire crackling. I'd like to try an experiment, said the professor. I want you all to close your eyes and keep them closed until I say you can open them. Now, I want you to tell me what you can smell. For instance, can you smell the smoke from the fire? Yes, chorused the children. Okay, can you smell the dampness and the rain? After a moment's hesitation, they nodded. Good. Anything else? Tom kept his eyes tightly closed and concentrated. It smells dusty in here, like hay. Good boy, said the professor. Ben, what am I holding under your nose? Keep your eyes closed. Ben sniffed, then grinned triumphantly. Plastic raincoat, he said. Lindy, what's this? Lindy smelled something vaguely familiar, yet she couldn't quite place it. Peanut butter? Terrific, said the professor. All right, Tom, keep your eyes closed. What's this? Banana. And this? Tom sniffed. I'm not quite sure. Can't you smell the toasted marshmallow? The boy hesitated. I'll hold it closer, Tom. Can you smell it now? Yes, I can. Let me smell, cried Lindy. That's good. What about you, Ben? Do you smell it? That's funny, I don't. Quite sure? Ben tried again. Yes, quite sure. Very well, you may open your eyes, said the professor. Ben looked around. I don't see a marshmallow. That's because there wasn't one, replied the professor. But I smelled it, cried Tom. I really did. I know, I'm delighted. It means you're beginning to make your imagination work for you. I wish I could have smelled it, said Ben wistfully. You will, Ben. Your turn will come. The professor began to pack what was left of the picnic into the basket. I think we'd better start heading for home. We've quite a ride in front of us, and I don't want to be out after dark without lights. Ben, pour this ginger ale on the fire, will you? The children reluctantly helped the professor to tidy up. They donned their raincoats and walked outside to their bicycles. I wish we weren't going, said Lindy with a backward glance at the barn. We will come again another day. The professor looked up at the sky and drew in a deep breath of rain-fresh air. I think it's going to clear up. He paused to watch a large bird flying silently across the field toward the wood. Look, look! It's probably going to roost for the night. How I'd love to be a bird. A wiffle bird? Tom grinned. The professor chuckled. No, I'd settle for being a skylark, or maybe a kestrel. He swung up onto his bike. Sorry. There we go. He swung up onto his bike and began to pedal unsteadily toward the road. Do you know how homing pigeons home, Ben? He called as the children followed him. No, sir. It's probably vision, and it's thought that dolphins use vision above water and guide themselves by the stars. He swerved to avoid a cuckhole. Amazing, isn't it? Lindy brought her bike alongside the professor's. You know so much, she said. Don't you sometimes feel bewildered when you think of the millions of things that put life together? The professor smiled. I'm not bewildered. I'm filled with the deepest awe and wonder. The miracle is that in its complexity, it all works. He bumped through a puddle and was drenched with water. Oh, fiddlesticks, I'll never get the hang of this contraption. For the rest of his journey, he grumbled and swore at his bicycle. This kept the children in fits of laughter, which was his intention, since it took their minds off the long way home. All right, we will end there, and tomorrow we'll get started on part 2 called Capture. Also, I want to know what your guys' favorite words are. What you think the sweetest words you've heard are, or what your favorite word is. All right, goodbye.